work for Ubisoft Montreal. I've been working with them for over a decade, which is really bizarre. I'm here today to talk to you a little about writing for games, which is very different from writing for any other entertainment medium. There's three parts to the talk. For some reason, this thing is acting weird. So the first section is going to explore what a game is and what its relationship to story is. Then I'll talk a little bit about the process at Ubisoft, how the writer works with everyone else on the development team. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the ways to break into the video game business, because it's not quite like breaking into film or television. All right, so I'll dive right in. So first up is figuring out what is a game. And a game is a collaboration between two stories told via scripted and systemic events. And that probably looks like a lot of gibberish, so we'll break it down so that you can better understand some of this stuff. And we'll start by looking at what I mean when I say two stories. And in order to do that, we have to take a look at how games actually function. So generally speaking, traditional media is passive. You watch it, you read it, you hear it. In other words, you consume content. And here is a little illustration. There we go. I don't know. My animations aren't working. So it goes in one direction, and that's it. You consume the content, and then you're done. So games are different because games are active, and content consumption is followed by interaction. And so here's another thing which might get messed up, so we'll go back to it. Looks like that. You consume the content, and then you interact with it, through a controller, through a keyboard. You send signals, you see the thing on the screen react to your input. And so here's a small caveat, because you can interact with a lot of passive media as well. You can shout at movies, you can cheer on your sports team, you can throw down a book that you hate, or hug it too if you love it, I guess. So we can say that traditional passive media will accept limited input, but it doesn't usually respond. And this is where games really diverge from all other forms of entertainment. Games respond. And so you interact with it, you provide the input, and the game provides feedback. And so you get this final loop, which is probably going to be messed up too, of consumption, interaction, and feedback. And the feedback that you receive is another form of content, and so the cycle begins all over again. And you loop through consuming, interacting, and receiving feedback. And so I tell you all of this because it reveals that video game stories are not one story, the protagonist story, the one that most of us are used to if you work in film or television or write. There's also the player story, which encompasses the interaction and feedback loop. And so games are actually telling two stories simultaneously. And here's another image to just help break down those two things. So the protagonist story is the story of the fictional world. It is the thing created by the author or authors. The player story is the story that is authored by you, the player. And these two stories need to work together in order to have a successful game. So I'll just run you through this, and probably the animation won't work, so I apologize. Protagonist story defines a narrative universe through setting, backstory, and tone, providing a stage for compelling characters and events on which we explore themes and ideas, creating an emotional outlet for creators and consumers. So yeah, I don't know, the animations are bad, I apologize. This is a very long-winded way of saying that the protagonist story provides context. The player story provides a series of rules and concepts that allow for active participation in a created space via controls, which are the tools a player uses to send and receive information. And again, very long-winded way of saying the player story defines interaction. And we wind up with these two things, context and interaction. And a lot of times these things are also referred to as narrative and gameplay, or as I've been saying, the protagonist story and the player story. And a lot of times these two things are considered to be in competition with one another. And there's no end to articles on the internet if you so choose to seek them out about which one is more important, how one hurts the other, how one often comes at the expense of the other. And I think it's a bad way to frame writing for games, that it is not you fighting the developer. It is not you as the writer fighting against the gameplay systems. It is about you and the designers working together to create an experience. And I think experience is a better word to use with games because it's more unified, it's more about the spirit of collaboration, and it's less about competition between two different disciplines. Experience describes the collaboration between the two narratives in games. So now we have these two narratives, the player story and the protagonist story, and we have two ways to tell these two stories, scripted and systemic events. Scripted events are everything from cutscenes to dialogue trees to very scripted puzzles to cinematic gameplay or QuickTime events to linear level layouts where you are funneled down a corridor and things happen, almost like an amusement park ride sometimes. Sometimes too much because people will complain. But Call of Duty, for example, and all of the games that are put out by Naughty Dog, whether it's Uncharted or The Last of Us, have taken this to an entirely new level, and they're absolutely wonderful, and there's totally room for them. They're very useful for developing the protagonist story. When you use scripted tools, it gives you, the author, the writer, a lot more control. You can decide where the camera is, what the character does, how they respond. You have a lot more control over the environment. Systemic gameplay is everything from economic systems to combat systems to navigation systems to the art, the active exploration, playing with vehicles, construction, destruction, and the open world layout where it's more, you often hear the term sandbox or playground. It's something where you, the player, determine what you're going to do with all of these tools. And so you'll see the word system a lot up here, and that's because systemic things tend to be systems. It's a series of rules that govern what the player can and can't do, but you, the player, are then the author, and these are the tools that you use to tell your story. So they're useful for developing the player's story. There are an infinite number of ways to combine scripted and systemic events. Every game is unique and special. I get a little upset when people talk about how there's only one way to make a game or one type of game. And what you need to do is ask yourself at the start of any game creation process, what is the experience you want to create? And what is the mix between the player's story and the protagonist story that you want to achieve? And then that will help inform to what degree you rely on scripted and systemic elements. Everything from Minecraft, again, to The Last of Us are acceptable forms of games. And they have a very different balance, right? Minecraft is far more systemic, and stuff that Naughty Dog does is far more scripted. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how, when we make an Assassin's Creed game, we try and utilize these rules. Sometimes we're more successful than other times. We're always learning. It's important to know that this is our process. Whoops. It's not the only way to do it. It's not the best way to do it. It's just the way that we do it. Every game is different, and so every game is made differently. So we start with conception. And conception is where we make all of our very high-level decisions. This is really, really, really big picture stuff. And the most important thing is defining the experience, defining the fantasy. And without that, if you can't nail that right away, you're gonna have a bad time while you're making a game. And from the writer's perspective, we do very high-level stuff. We pick our protagonist, we pick our antagonist. For AC, we pick the year that the game is going to take place. We pick the themes that we want to explore. We pick the locations where we're going to go. And then we talk also about the high-level fantasy. So AC3 was all about revolutionary America. And so that had implications, which we'll look at in a minute. And AC4 Black Flag was all about a pirate fantasy. And so that had very different implications as well, for everything from character creation to the type of story that we wanted to tell, to the type of people that you would encounter. One of the big things that we do also is we research. I love history, but I'm not an expert in history. So we reach out to people that are actually experts in the field. AC3, we worked with tons and tons of consultants from all over, people that were experts both on Kanien'kehá:ka culture, language. We worked with revolutionary historians. When we worked on AC2, we took several research trips to Italy. So we're always working, and we often have on site someone that is there to help us with the research as well. So we'll have usually a professor at the nearby university to vet some of our decisions, and then we'll have someone on site that can help us pick out names or dates or find where certain characters were, where we could get away with saying they were based on the historical record. So this is what all the writers are doing. And then at the same time, during conception, the designers are undergoing a very similar process by trying to define the experience through gameplay. And so when it comes to AC, we have these three pillars that are unique to our franchise that are there for every single version. And it's navigation, combat, and stealth. Those are our three pillars, or free running, combat, and stealth, depends on how you want to phrase it. And they all come with these specific elements that are there in every AC game. And then depending on the game, we come up with different types of gameplay to support whatever the experiences that we want to create. So here you'll see we had 2 AC games that had all of these pillars in them. And then we diverged in terms of the stuff that we started to introduce in support of the experience we wanted to create. So as you can see for Black Flag, there were treasure hunts, bar fights, boarding, a lot of naval exploration. Then for the Revolution, we had a lot of horseback riding, firing lines. We tried to do massive crowds to recreate some of the battles, a lot of interactions with historical figures. And so depending on the specific experience you want to create, you want your gameplay to support it. And you can't impose things, and this really goes in both directions. You shouldn't be creating gameplay that's at odds with the experience you're trying to create, and you shouldn't be trying to write a story that's not going to be supported by the gameplay. And this is where the idea of collaboration comes in. So even throughout the entire conception process, everyone is constantly talking to everyone. As a writer, most of my actual writing happened at night or on the weekends or during holidays. I used to spend the winter break in the studio because there was no one there. I got most of my work done then. Because during the day you have to meet with everyone as they're building the game, as they're designing systems, as they're doing the art, as they're building out the world. Because everyone needs to be doing this hand in hand. It's not like a film, for example, where you'll finish the script in your office, turn it in, have some execs look at it, then the director takes it eventually and hopefully doesn't ruin it. This is a non-stop collaborative process from beginning to end. And I'll show you, and this is just conception. So now we'll get into pre-production. And before we even reach pre-production, we go through what we call the blueprint process. And the blueprint process is basically putting the entire game up on a wall on paper. So we basically paper prototype things. So as a writer, at the very beginning of Blueprint, the writer will generate a very high-level treatment. So as you can see here, I blocked out a thing from AC3. This was almost an hour's worth of gameplay, but at this point, it's only there as a couple of sentences. Because I don't want to get in the way of the mission designers at this point, or the people that are building the systems. I want to provide a context, like I was saying, and so we have that here. And then later on, we'll start to get into the finer details. So while I'm doing this as the writer, coming up with the high-level story, the mission designers are going through prototyping of missions. They're sitting around and saying, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? Or the time period supports this kind of event. And they're also building out the progression curve. So how does our hero grow and develop, not just as a person, which is my responsibility, but as a player avatar, which is their responsibility. So everything from the skills that you unlock, to the features that we tutorialize, to the way that the character progresses throughout the game. Then we meet at Blueprint and we bring it all together. And it's usually about a 2-week process. And like I said, we build the whole game on paper, on a giant board. And I'm putting up my narrative stuff. The mission designers are putting up their missions. We're talking in depth about, brainstorming, thinking about ways to start expanding things. We're making lists of all of the resources that we're going to need, whether it's art or stuff that's built into the world, or stuff that we might need in terms of cutscenes. It's all that stuff gets put up there. And this is sort of what a finished blueprint looks like from a very high level. It's probably not super useful because you just see a bunch of dots, but each of those dots represents missions or interactions. And someday we will have a nice program that will allow you to zoom all the way down in so that as you get to each dot, it'll show you maps of the entire mission that you're going through. But so this is what we usually come out of Blueprint with. These images go up all over the floor so that people have a visual representation of the game. One of our challenges a lot of times is getting people on the team to read the scripts, to read the treatments. We find that people respond better to visual aids. So we put this up there so that people can have a sense of what it is that we're doing. So once the blueprint is made, we go into pre-production. Now we have our recipe and we have to start, baking the cake and hope that it comes out okay. This is when I start to write in earnest, and it sucks. It is long hours and very painful, but I do it. And the mission designers are building their missions. So I'm writing scripts and they're building missions, and we're talking constantly. So this is, again, where collaboration really comes into play. Every day we're talking. This is what I've written. They're saying this is what they've built. What I try and avoid at this stage is worrying too much about dialogue that is super event specific. So I'll focus on mission intros or mission outros or character moments that won't be as dependent on gameplay but need to be in there for the development of our protagonist and his or her story. So this is my attempt at visualizing the collaboration between the writer and the mission designer. And what happens is that the more and more that we talk, the more and more their mission design document gets fleshed out. I say it would be great if the character could go here and do this, and they'll say we really want the character to go here and do this. Can you provide a context for it? And so it's a lot of back and forth, a lot of compromise, a lot of collaboration. And we are really creating this together. The mission designer is as much a part of the narrative process as the writer. You're telling a story when you build your game worlds, right? The very actions that you engage in. The player story essentially is key to the experience. So once we have those mission design documents and I have the beginnings of a script, we go into full-blown production. In full-blown production, for me, this is the way I do it, everyone's a little bit different, is I take those mission design documents that they've created and I paste them into a script writing program that we have called Oasis. And it looks and acts much like Final Draft or Celtics. But it does a whole bunch of other stuff in the back end that's useful for the production team. And I will use their mission design document to craft slug lines and to break out beats. And so the missions they've designed literally become the spine of my story. And obviously, if there are changes or things that I want to do differently, I'll go and see them. And I'll work very closely with the various mission designer and game designers throughout the entire process. And so you'll see here, there's a bunch of back and forth. There's notes and comments from, in this case, a bunch of red line from the mission design director as we talk about the script that I've written and the stuff that's going to actually be there from a gameplay perspective. So it's a non-stop back and forth, constantly evolving, constant iteration. It's a lot of work and it's not always fun. Then, once that's done, I come out of it with a first draft of a script, which ostensibly covers the entire game, and we all go into a meeting and they ruin it. They like absolutely shit all over it. I hope I'm allowed to swear. And this is really devastating, and if you do not have a thick skin, this is not the business for you, at least the way we do it. Like, this is brutal. So what'll happen is we'll all get into a room. It'll be me, the creative director, a producer, cinematics director, mission designer, usually the lead designer, and we will go through the script. We will do a full read-through, like line by line by line, not just the dialogue, but all of the action, because the action text describes the gameplay as well. And just like we built the game on paper a long time ago, now we do a read-through the entire game. And we're making changes as we go through this entire process. We'll trim a lot of dialogue, we'll move scenes around, we'll realize that some gameplay may not be working. Something that we're adding now to the process on some projects, which I think is really interesting and kind of fun, is we are starting to essentially run role-playing sessions where we'll bring in people to play as players, as different types of players, whether it's someone that's very into story or someone that's very into action or someone that really, really wants to break your game. And we'll sit them down in the room and the mission designer will act as a dungeon master and the players will move through the environment and we're taking notes as they do this in the room live and making changes there as well. The other thing that we do during this time is we break out all of the needs for our cinematics and we define them in terms of quality and complexity. If you have more than just a couple of characters on the screen, it becomes wildly complex. So we decide, you can see there's like L's and M's and H's. And we have a very tight budget. You can only have so many high quality animations or ones that are high complexity, I guess. They should all be high quality. And we'll also be timing things, right? Because everyone seems to hate long cutscenes, so we're always trying to trim stuff. And we build out this giant spreadsheet, which will then be used as another blueprint for production. And we come out of that meeting and I make all of the changes. And as you can see here, like entire pages of script are decimated and become about 3 lines. You really have to be okay with killing your darlings and watching other people like take them and smash them against rocks. And again, like you need to have a thick skin. You have to find a way to be creative, to maintain and preserve your vision while at the same time giving your coworkers and the hundreds of other people that you could be working with what they need. After that, we take it and we start recording. We start doing motion capture. We bring in the actors. We do read-throughs. We do mocap on the mocap stage, and we start pushing all of that data into the game. And once that stuff is integrated, we go through a finaling process. And that is further integration, polish, and debugging. We have people that are now playing through the game. So again, we try and go back and iterate this time. It's not on paper, it's actually in the engine. So we sit down and we play through it and we shit all over it and we go back at the end of the day and we try and make changes and try and improve things as the process goes on. We also do a lot of play testing at this stage, we'll bring in people from off the street, and they will play the game, and they'll give feedback, stuff that works for them, stuff that doesn't work for them, and we'll also be observing them, seeing if there are places where they get stuck, if the heat maps tell us that they're not visiting a part of the map. There's all of these different things that are going on at this stage. And the longer that you have to do this, the more polished your game will be. You don't want to wind up in a situation where you've only got 2 weeks to polish your game, because then you're going to be in a really big mess. And so you hope, once that's done, that what comes out the other end is good and is well received. And this definitely speeds through how we make the game, but I think the important thing to take away from it, like I said, is that it's intensely collaborative, and that the writer is just one of many storytellers on a project, and you have to be able to recognize that, that you are telling a story, you are creating an experience with dozens, if not hundreds of people, and their voices are all just as important, and you have to find a way, like I said, to maintain your voice and vision throughout all of that. It's a lot of very creative problem solving. I sometimes joke that my job as a writer was to create the best version of someone else's terrible idea. And it's not entirely true, but it can sometimes feel that way. And it goes on and on and on and on. This is not just something that you do for a couple of weeks. There have been games I've worked on where I've been writing for 2-3 years. Because even once the main script is done and the cutscenes are in, there are tutorials to write. In the AC games, we have the Animus database, and there's a team of writers that have to work on that. And then in some cases, we even bring in comedians to do comedy polish. So it's always different, and it never ends. And even once that's done, then you're working with the strategy guide people, or we have an encyclopedia that we have to review to make sure that the yearly updates make sense and track with what's in the game. There's a lot of continuity to maintain. So it depends, right? Games that don't have as thick a narrative layer probably don't have to go quite as insane as we do. I bet you the people at BioWare have an even harder time. They have even more stuff to track and even more stuff to maintain. So that's sort of our process in a nutshell. And now I'll walk you through, I don't know why you'd want to, but if you do want to work in games, some of the ways you can do it. There's no easy way. I'll start with my story. It's very weird, it's very atypical, but I feel like most people's are. I started out, I went to college, I graduated college, I didn't want to get a job. My friend told me that USC had a grad school for film producers called the Peter Stark Producing Program. I went there, it's a 2-year program. I graduated with a degree that apparently said I was a producer. I don't know what that means. So my partner and I decided we had gone to school for producing, we were just gonna become producers. So we printed up letterhead and business cards, and we just did it. And we got very lucky, because 6 months after graduation, we actually sold a movie. And we sold it to the place where I'd had my summer internship, which was Disney. And so then all of a sudden, okay, we had sold a movie to a studio, we set up a bunch more, and none of them ever got made. All right, this was probably 12 years ago, and I think we sold upwards of 8 or 9 movies, and none of them ever got made. They all went into development hell, and it was not fun. And it's not a way to make a living. You can't survive off of just getting development fees. They're small. It feels good, and your name is in the trades, and everyone wants to be your friend for a week, but you have to eat. The other part of that is that I love games. Like, I really love games. Like, I've been playing games since I was probably 4 or 5 years old. I still play them. I played them nonstop on the flight over here. I would play them when I'm done with this talk. I play every night. I do 2 things every night when I get home from work. I play games for at least 2 to 3 hours, and then I watch TV for at least 2 to 3 hours. And I consider it work, right? But I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. So now I'm getting sidetracked. Yes, so we were producers, quote unquote producers. And we met with Ubisoft, and we said to them, we want to turn Raving Rabbids didn't even exist yet. It was still Rayman. We want to turn Rayman into a Saturday morning cartoon. And they were like, no. But you guys seem cool, so come up and visit our studio in Montreal and let's just see what happens. It was really that weird. I'm glossing over some stuff. We had done a job for Sony that was like a very small, very unpleasant experience, where we tried to do it like the normal writing way, where they were based out of the UK, and we wrote a script in LA. We never went and saw the developer. We just sent them pages. They butchered the pages. We had no idea what the game looked like or played like, and it was a disaster. And ever since then, I won't work that way. When I write on a game, I integrate with the team. I sit with the team. You have to. It's not something that you can do freelance or from afar. I guess you can do it freelance, but you have to be willing to move there. You have to be willing to move there and sit with the team until the game ships. And if you're not willing to do that, then I'm begging you, please don't go into games, because it ruins it for everyone else. It's not that it can't happen, it sometimes happens. Anyway, the point, where was I? So I went up there, it was supposed to be a 6-month contract, and now it's, almost 11, 12 years later, and I'm still working up there. And a big part of the reason was that I love games. So now I finally got to be doing what I think I always really wanted to do, which was work in games. Sometimes people ask me, oh, what do you want to do when you're done with games? Or what are you hoping to like parlay this into? And no, I'm doing what I want to do and I'm done. Like, I hope I can do this for the rest of my life. So yeah, that's sort of the short, chopped up version of my story, which is not important because I don't know if that's like the best way to go about getting into games. But there is no best way, right? So with TV, people, they write specs, right? And they find agents and they generate stuff and send it around. We don't really do that with games, right? You're not like sending spec scripts to people for an Assassin's Creed game most of the time. If you do that, it'll get sent back because we're all terrified of being sued. And the really important thing is that 9 times out of 10, when people from outside the industry want to get involved, they have no experience with game design or game production. And I know it's a little bit of a catch-22, but at least know enough and play enough that you can talk smartly about the design process and what it is to actually build a game. And again, I think a lot of that has to do, because I assume that you all have expertise when it comes to the protagonist story, it's understanding what the player's story is and how it works and how it interfaces with the protagonist story. So, one option is schools. Some people have done this successfully. It tends to be in other areas though, whether it's illustration or animation or programming. I think more and more some of these programs, especially Full Sail and USC now to a degree, are looking at more creative ways in. There are programs for designers, for creative writing. So that may be something that starts to be a viable way in. I can't say for sure, but it's an option. Another option, and this has been going on for a long time, it's mods. And it's primarily what designers have done to break into the business. But every now and then you hear about people that have done it from the writing side. There's a company that made a game called Neverwinter back in the day, and they released this thing called the Aurora toolset, where you could build your own modules, essentially. And one of the things that they would do when they were looking for writers for a brief period of time is they said to people, well, build something with our toolset and submit it. That's your writing sample. That's your job app. So other times you can just make your own mods in your spare time and put them up on the web, get people playing them, get people talking about them, and that's one way to start to try and make a name for yourself. Another really interesting thing, if you're less interested in the mechanical stuff but still interested in the interactive aspect, is a program called Twine. It's that last little box on the bottom in the far right. And it is primarily for text-based narrative games, and it's got a burgeoning scene. You can go look it up afterwards. It's something that people are using more and more. You can generate content relatively quickly, assuming you have a story and idea in mind, and get it out there for people to experience and interact with. Another option is to do it yourself. There are a lot of, and every day there's more and more of them. There's the App Store, obviously. Steam has the green light process, for better or worse. I think for better, because it gives people a way to get their stuff out there. There's Kickstarter, obviously that's like the new big thing. And then other people, Portal, they started out as a group of kids that were making a game as a final project at their school. I think they were at USC, I could be wrong. So you don't take my word for that. And they later got picked up by Valve, and Nabtacular Drop became Portal, and everyone lived mostly happily ever after. SpiderWeb Software is this amazing dude, Jeff Vogel, who has been cranking out tile-based RPGs. It's like him and a couple of other people for decades, and he just makes his games himself. And he's a prolific writer. His games are filled with prose. And he just does it himself, and he sells it on his website, and I think he sells it through Steam now too sometimes. And you can buy his games on the iPad too. I recommend them. If you're into like really old school tile-based RPGs, his games are pretty fun. Then you can also write elsewhere, and this is risky, but it's also definitely a way in. There was a writer that wrote on Hellgate, which is probably not a great example, but he had started out as an IGN writer who was covering games, reviewing games. Guy from Destructoid went on to write Borderlands, which is pretty impressive. But again, he got his start in the journalism section. A woman I work with, Jill Murray, started by writing young adult novels, and then transitioned into games. And there was a game that came out last year that was incredible called Brothers, and the director of that game is a film director, and that's his movie Zozo, I guess. And that's one of the rare instances where you saw someone transition from film to games and something wonderful came out the other end, because a lot of times something wonderful doesn't come out the other end. And I think a big part of that is that he's really passionate about games. He fucking loves them, and that was reflected. And one of the things that Brothers does amazingly is there's no dialogue, or there's no English dialogue, right? It's gibberish language. But he understood that mechanics were a way to tell his story also. And I don't want to spoil anything. Like if you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. It's very impressive. And then a guy that works at Ubisoft also, Lucien Soldan, did a lot of work in the pen and paper world. And we have quite a few writers now at Ubisoft actually who got their start in that universe, because that's a great place to look at the marriage between the protagonist and the player's story. Because a lot of pen and paper stuff, it concerns itself almost primarily, right, with systems and game design. It may not be on a screen, it's on paper, but there are rules and there are systems, and you have to learn to find a way to tell a story that interacts with those. So we've seen a lot of success with people transitioning from that universe into the video game universe. And then there's what we're doing at Ubisoft, which is something a little bit new, is we've started a writer internship program, which is only open to Canadians. So if you're not Canadians, we can't help you at this time. And about once a year, we bring on an intern. I've had 3 interns. 2 of them are full-time employees now, writing on games, and the 3rd one will become one shortly, at which time we will open it back up and look for our next intern. I wish more studios were doing this. I don't think they are. It's a shame. Hopefully they'll start to copy us. I want them to. It's a great way in. It takes some of the burden off that you need to know how design and production work. You can come in and learn trial by fire, spend 6 months with a team, learn as you go. And this is a way in. And so maybe more places will do it, and if they don't, then you should apply when we reopen for internship within the next 6 months. So this is probably the most important thing, though. Yes, you have to be passionate. You have to be persistent. There's a guy at Ubisoft, Jeffrey Yohalem, who has written on tons of games. When I first met him, we were at E3. He did not work in games. He wanted to work in games, and he came up and harassed us while we were drinking at a bar, and everyone told him to fuck off. And he did it again the next day and the next day, and kept at it, and was super persistent, and his stuff was really good, and now he works at Ubisoft. So there's a fine line between persistence and stalking and harassing. So there's no guideline for that. I guess just use your judgment. But going to things like GDC, and again, harass is probably not the right word, but engage with developers, sell them on yourself, show them your stuff. You'll find that they tend to be very open. GDC is a good place to do it. I don't know if Vancouver has an IGDA chapter. I would think they do. Those can sometimes be good. I have to tell you, as a developer, they can sometimes also be overwhelming, so I don't go as much as I used to because you can get bombarded. But you shouldn't use that as a reason not to do it. Go. It's an opportunity. It's a potential place to get your foot in the door, to meet people. So that's an option. If you live in Toronto, once a month there's something called Toru Taru, which is a gathering at a bar, and it's all the indie developers and some of the AAA developers gather there. Another place to go and bug them and try and make friends and try and get a foot in the door that way. But I think for me, the most important thing is to play all the time. You don't have to play as much as I do, like I have a problem, but you need to be playing a lot. And I don't care what you're playing, that doesn't matter. You should probably be playing some of the big releases if that's where you want to eventually be, just to understand the market, just to understand how big and complicated and insane these things are. But just play. I don't care what you play, just play. And really consume all kinds of media, right? Read books, watch movies, watch television. Television is very similar in a lot of ways to the way that we are now writing in games, trying to put together writers' rooms, trying to focus more on characters and less on plot, trying to think of things in terms of arcs and episodes. The 3-act structure doesn't really work very well with games these days, especially as they've ballooned from being 8 hours long to anywhere to 120 hours long. You need to think about ways to sustain the narrative for a prolonged period of time. And being able to tell a story in 90 minutes is very different than being able to tell a story over 7 seasons of television. And so I think TV is a really interesting model. And just like TV, we're focusing more and more on creating characters. And I think that's it. Yep, that's it. I'm done. So hopefully you have questions, and I'll try and answer them. And yeah.
Hi. Okay. Awesome presentation, by the way.
Thanks.
So for the internship, what would you be looking for as far as like application process?
We just ask for writing samples. Be an amazing writer. That's all I care about for the internship, because we'll take care of the other stuff.
And is there any like announcement of like, oh, we're opening it again? Is there any way to like subscribe to that?
Ubisoft usually they have a job site and it pops up on there. I also will tweet it when it opens up, but that's about the only way. I don't know how a recruitment website works, so I don't know if there's a way to like tell it to email you. Probably not. You probably just have to
So I'll just stalk you
stalk
instead.
the site. Yeah, that works too.
Oh, is it paid? Oh, is it paid, by the way?
Yes, it is a
Oh,
paid
awesome.
internship. That's right. Unlike the film business, we don't do unpaid internships.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. Oops. Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Sorry there. Hi there.
Hi. Oh, okay. There you
over
go.
here.
Yeah.
So for Assassin's Creed, with the multiple chapters and installments and the overall arc of the game, when you first started with Assassin's Creed 1, did you just have that first game in mind with the story, and then are you doing it as you go along, or did you do about a 3-year plan or a 4-story plan or anything like that?
We had an infinite plan. We had a brand Bible, a universe Bible. Obviously, it's not as detailed as the games as they get developed and come out are. There is hidden away somewhere in Ubisoft a PowerPoint presentation I made 2007 that goes through at least 16 different time periods, the assassins that would be there, what they would be doing, where it fits into the bigger picture. And we have a brand team now that oversees a lot of that stuff as well, that tries to ensure continuity as things get bigger and bigger and bigger. But we try to have as much of a plan as you realistically can at the beginning, but we most certainly didn't like poop it out and then say, oh shit, now we have to scramble and figure out what's going on. Even if it sometimes seems that way, I promise there was at least a plan on paper. Things change, different people get involved and have different ideas, and like I said, you have to make the most of it, and someone decides to go this way, you have to try and do what you can to make it work. So yeah, even the most secure and best laid plans have a tendency to change when new people come on board.
Hi, thanks for the talk, by the way. I'm an artist, and when you mentioned that you work a lot with the mission designers, I was just wondering, like, do you also work with like concept artists?
Oh,
and,
yeah, for sure.
What's that process like?
So there'll be a character bio, for example, and the concept artist will take the character bio and we'll have a conversation, and then they'll go off and create their, version of the character, and then we'll have a talk about, does this work, does it match? I would say 50% of the time, it's not at all what I expected, it's better. And then I'm like, this is fantastic. I happen to, we're very lucky. We have amazing, amazing, amazing artists at Ubisoft, like amazing. So it's very rare that it's like, oh my God, you got it all wrong. It'll be more, tweaks, or we decide at some point that something in this character's backstory means that they're missing a finger, so you have to update that, or, they have a pet, or they have a fondness for a particular piece of clothing that has significance to them. So there'll be tweaks like that. But yeah, 99.9% of the time, it's sort of, here's what I wrote, and then you create it. Because people need to feel like they're actually making a contribution and that they're not just cogs, right? And so you have to empower all of the artists, whether it's an actual artist or an artist in a different sense of the word. And you try and collaborate and go hand in hand as much as possible. Sure.
This one? Me? Yep. Hi there.
Hi.
Can you describe your department? Like, what's the setup for your narrative team? Do you have narrative designers as well as writers? And the cadence of your writer's room.
So every project is different. In my position now, I'm there to sort of oversee and advocate, and every team is allowed to do things as they see fit. And I am there to say, that seems like a good idea, or you may want to consider something else. And the way Alice is set up is that, like I said, we're there to help, to advocate, to support. So it's not my job to oversee or boss around. I'm no one's boss. I am there so if someone says, I'd like you to read my treatment, I'd like you to play through the build, I want to sit down and talk about X, Y, or Z. I have weekly meetings with almost every team, so I'll sit down with all of the writers and we'll talk through what they're up to that week, any challenges that they see coming up, stuff like that. I'm going to a studio pretty much as soon as I leave here, I guess day after tomorrow, to sit with the writing team there for a couple of weeks to just see what they've been working on and talk through any issues they're having. And if they're not having any issues, then great, it makes my life a lot easier. And then every team is structured differently. One team I'm working with right now has a huge writing team. It's like, well, at least for me, it seems huge. There are 6 or 7 of them. And then to get to what you were saying, one of the things that I'm really pushing for internally now, and we're seeing more and more of, is the position of the narrative director. And the narrative director tends to be someone that is more design-oriented. They have an understanding of narrative and an appreciation of narrative. They tend not to write as much. They tend to oversee the writers and let the writers practice their craft, and then they practice their craft, which is ensuring the integration of what the writing team is generating with what the people on the production floor are producing. And that's sort of a nice way to ensure that there's some amount of steady oversight, and someone that's dedicated to making sure that the player's story and the protagonist's story are traveling down the same road hand in hand.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question, actually, a bit like the artist question. What about translators, actually?
We have so up in Alice, the department I work in, the woman that sits across from me is the head of localization. So every game is localized in a bazillion different languages most of the time. And we have a program that they actually created in-house so that now the localization team can communicate directly with the writers. You'll pull up a thing on your browser, and there'll be questions from the localization team. What do you mean exactly by this sentence? What's the context here? Do you literally mean, you know, X, Y, and Z? Or I don't understand this phrase. We don't have an analog in our language. And so there's more and more now than there used to be back and forth between those departments. The other thing, though, that's true is that I think the last I saw, it's something like 80-something% of people that play our games, even though they're released worldwide, play them in English. Sometimes there's a little bit of a difference with the AC games. Some people like to play with the voice track in the native language, but then with English subtitles. So those are a little bit of a special case, I suppose.
Hi there, Corey.
Hi.
My name is Frank. I'm an indie developer launching our beta game next month. And I was wondering, when you talked about protagonist versus player story,
Yeah.
how, like, in terms of, is there a framework that you go about thinking about how that kind of works together? Because we have no story right now.
Every game is different, and maybe you don't need a strong protagonist story, but you do, I would think, need rules for the world that your game takes place in, even if it's a matter of just art direction and style, right? That's still part of it. So it may not be a ton of dialogue, or it may not be a ton of characters, but you're looking for consistency, right? And you're looking for things that serve whatever that core experience is that you're trying to create. There's no formula. If anyone tries to tell you there is one, you should probably run away. And it's always going to be different. You just have to think about, is there an opportunity for traditional narrative support given the kind of game that you're making? And if there isn't, then that's fine. But if there is, then you look for ways to do it, I guess, efficiently, right? So maybe it's just a text crawl, or maybe it's bits of text that appear, or it's something that you can take a look at in the pause menu, because I assume that if you're making an indie game, you're not going to fill it with crazy elaborate cutscenes. But you still ideally would like to have the experience connected by something, even if it's just a couple of sentences at the beginning, or something that's even just in the description of the game, something that gives you a narrative frame for the game that you're playing.
Can you give an example?
Something like Kingdom Rush, for example, right? Does not have, it's a tower defense game, right? There's no real story there, but there's still a sense of personality and flavor that's consistent throughout the thing. And all of the units have like little one-liners that they spit out that all sort of fit within that world. And so that's a very light narrative frame, but it's still there, right? It's not completely devoid of context. It's not just a purely mechanical exercise. And again, it's all served by the same stuff, like the creature design and the art direction of the maps and the little blurbs that come out of the character's mouth all feed into this sort of, it's cutesy, and there's like a sense of humor to it without, but it's not thick, but it's there. I mean, I think that's one version. I think League of Legends, they're struggling, or not struggling, but they're adapting they're trying to figure out if they're going to have a meta narrative and what that's going to mean and how it justifies like all the summoners. But every single summoner like has a personality, right? Like work is done even for those little one-liners that they spit out on the battlefield that tell you who they are. And so that's all character creation in a very traditional sense.
Thanks. That's all.
Yeah.
Hi there. My
Hi.
name's Tatenda. I'm from Zimbabwe. Lived in LA for a little bit, and I went to UCLA for producing, so I know what that development hell feels
Yes.
like. But yeah, I was gonna ask. I think I'll just maybe just make a comment about how I guess when I play a game, I feel like even though I'm using the system, the fun part of it for me is being the protagonist whilst being myself at the same time. So I'd like to hear how you handle that sort of that balance, so as not to like make the player feel like they're not.
So it's hard. You know, every game, like I keep saying, and I know it's probably getting boring, is different. So there's no right way. Like some people love David Cage's games and other people hate them. Some people think Gone Home is a masterpiece and other people think it spells the death of video games. And I think that there's room for everything. So there's no one way. And again, it comes down to what you like as a player, right? You're going to be attracted to different games. I do think that all games, no matter what the perspective or point of view or whatever, want to minimize dissonance between the player and the character. And you have to look for ways to ensure that what you're doing is being reflected in the way you expect it to be on the screen. And that's a more general thing, right? It doesn't matter if it's a first-person shooter where you're a generic and nameless whatever. You want those interactions as you press the buttons, as you move the controller, to be reflected properly in the game. For me, a game like Prey is something that I always use as an example, because as I was playing through it, crazy stuff would happen. And I remember at one point I was like, holy shit, and the character, Tommy, said the exact same thing. And in that moment, I felt like I was him. And this is not a game that's known for like some tremendous, riveting narrative, but in those moments where the character in the game was behaving in a way that felt exactly, the way I thought it should, that was when I was most united with him. We have this problem even with the AC games, right? Because the characters in the cutscenes are often quite different from the characters during gameplay, right? You have people that are ostensibly thoughtful and are not mass murderers, and then you turn the control back over to the player and they hack everyone up. I should probably not talk about my game. We'll talk about Uncharted instead, right? So Drake is this lovable, charming, roguish guy who, when he's not in the cutscenes, is murdering, hundreds of people. I really want them to open the next game with him like being tried in some criminal court for like destroying, sacred sites around the world, but I don't think they'd ever do that. And so that's always a bit of a challenge, right? We see it a lot of times in games too, where it's like, oh, I'm some young, naive person that's in over my head, and 5 minutes later, I know how to use a machine gun, right? Imagine if you picked up a machine gun and tried to use it for the first time, and then imagine trying to capture that in a game. I think for every person that would be like, yeah, that's fucking cool, there'd be twice as many that are like, that's not why I paid $60. I paid $60 so that when I pick up that machine gun. So what that means is that we should focus on creating characters where that transition is natural. I don't like when people are like, whatever, it's just a game, so we'll just gloss over that. It's like we can work a little harder to try and smooth out those cracks. But what I consider important work, other people consider very expensive and not worthwhile. So it's a constant back and forth.
Hey there, I've got a two-part thing, one part
Okay.
information, one part question.
Okay.
The information is for the writers and artists around here, that there are similar groups to the Toronto group where you can engage with developers. That's full indie. They
Okay.
hold on a meetup group, and there's also Vancouver Social Games, so you can go and meet developers there.
It's great.
The question is, in traditional storytelling, we have the hero's journey, the themes and archetypes, like the story archetypes that are set in stone. I was wondering, in your experience and people you've talked to, have you found any that have essentially a large difficulty translating to the gaming medium?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that there's stuff that's necessarily hard. There's stuff that people tend to focus on. The new big thing in the video game industry is everyone talking about Save the Cat. That's their new favorite, like, everyone read Save the Cat. Everyone read Save the Cat. I don't know if you saw this. There was a thing that was posted last week where someone wrote to a bunch of very famous authors saying, what did you mean when you did this? Or were you thinking about like the symbolism of blah, blah, blah when you wrote your book? And they all wrote back and were like, no, I just wrote a story. And it's great that you pulled us out of it, or the fact that, you know, storytelling in general tends to fall into patterns. I don't know if it's something that's biological or something that we just pick up as kids reading them, but there's not necessarily, I don't know. I guess I don't have a good answer to your question, unfortunately.
Hi, Corey. There is VSG. There's also Women in Games as well here in town. There's lots of indie studios here, so there's lots of different places where you can go and access that information. Meet up. But my question is more about, so you started as a film producer.
Yes.
And then somehow went from like, oh, reading a 120-page script to writing a 7-year, like.
So yes,
Where-
I will.
what
I
was
will
that
fill
transition
in
like?
the. I will fill in the gaps slightly, so that when we were producing, we weren't doing it in the traditional sense, or we were doing it more as creative producers. So like when we sold our project to Disney, it wasn't just us coming in with a writer. We came in with a 40-page treatment that we had written and a bunch of maquettes and artwork that we had commissioned with our artist partner. And so we had come into it through a more creative, more writing-oriented version. So there, I guess that makes the transition like a little more natural. It wasn't just us reading specs and then like launching them out and dividing up territories every Friday. We would come up with an idea, we would package a pitch, and we would go in and we would try, because you could also get a little bit more money that way. That's the one secret, is that if you sell a pitch and you have artwork or a treatment, you'll get more than the development fee. We sold the treatments. We didn't write the scripts. I didn't want to. I think my writing partner secretly did. But you could sell that for extra money. Does that help at least? There was writing going on, I guess is what I'm trying to say, even when we were producing.
Yeah, so that brought in the thicker skin that comes into gaming.
Yes. I also think I like being bossed around, so it's always come pretty naturally to me. I like being told what to do. A lot of people don't, but I don't have a problem with that. I don't know if that's, maybe getting too personal.
Hi, Corey. Thanks
Hi.
for being here today. I was just wondering, for actors who want to get into video game production, what do you recommend?
Voice acting, my experience has been that voice acting is very different than live action acting. So the more that you can put things like that on your resume, it could be as simple as doing stuff for radio or doing animated work or improv. A lot of the voice actors that we work with are like crazy improv people. A lot of them work on Saturday morning cartoons, or did before they started. I guess there are no more Saturday morning cartoons, but there's still cartoons, right? Last week was the end. It was the last Saturday morning cartoon block ever, and it's gone now. So that's what I would say, is the more that you can pad your resume or contribute to your body of work with stuff that is more voice focused and less on camera focused, the better. Things are starting to get blurred though, right? Because now we're doing a lot of performance capture and motion capture or facial capture. But I still find that because the fidelity is not there, even with all the crazy rigs, you need people that understand how to exaggerate certain emotions in a way that is not over the top, but still reads better on the screen, right? Because we don't have that one-to-one fidelity yet, and so much is lost. There were moments where I remember watching the actor, like, because we videotape them as they're getting scanned, and watching their performance live, for me, was so much more powerful. There was a moment where I got sad. It was the one moment where I was like, maybe I do want to work in live action, because this all sounds so much better when it's the real person saying it, but it passed. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. A lot of times we split them too, right? Like the person doing the performance capture is not always the person also doing the voice. Some people are making a killing being the whole package, and I think it's part of why like Troy Baker and Nolan North and Roger Craig Smith are like in every game.
Do you find they're going through agencies?
Yes. And I left this out, I'm sorry. Some people, they do it less and less now. Some of the big agencies have video game departments. Back when I started doing games, William Morris, it wasn't William Morris Endeavor at the time, it was William Morris, had video game agents. And none of the film and TV clients there wanted to do it because the pay was atrocious, especially relative to what they could be making. It still is, by the way. And so we had agents, and then William Morris shut that down. Now CAA and ICM, no, not ICM. ICM did, they don't anymore, because Jordan Mechner from Prince of Persia, his agent at the time was this guy Keith Boski, who was the video game agent at ICM, but now Keith just does his own thing. CAA has it and UTA has it still, but they tend to represent developers now, because that's like a bigger, better, fancier business, but they still rep some writers. So that is one way in. If you can get signed by CAA, you probably will be doing cooler things than video game writing. I shouldn't say that. You should be. So yes, it's possible. And I don't know if there are other agencies that do it. Then there are video game agencies, but again, I think they primarily represent developers. So there's DDM and ISM, but I don't think they represent individuals. But CAA and UTA do, just not very many. But that is potentially one way in.
Hi. Lovely presentation. I just wanted to ask about the internship submissions. Is there a specific format that they should be in, like game script or something?
No. Like I said, just send a cover letter and whatever you think best represents you as a writer. I hired someone. She had written anthology pieces. There wasn't even a single script in there. It was just short stories, and they were incredible. So now she works at Ubisoft.
Question, and now I have a mic. Little flash from the past. About 18 years ago, I'm working for HarperCollins in a CD-ROM software division, producing a game.
Okay.
And at that time, the games are to be, you, the player, will determine the course of the story. You recall that. That was extremely difficult to make work, obviously. You need an infinite number of choices. So go back from that. So going forward to the way you put together games today, what is the purpose of the interactivity?
So the interactivity it's another way to express the experience that you're trying to create, right? It's a way to further engage with the fantasy. Rather than just reading about the life of a pirate, if you buy Black Flag, you will experience the life of a pirate. And you can't do that without the interactivity, right? Like the very act of boarding a boat, taking it out into the ocean, and then blasting other ships with your cannons, and that's you, the player, controlling all of that, building up your empire, trading resources. So that's where the interactivity comes into, right?
So you're acting out the story.
Yes, you're feeding into whatever that particular experience or fantasy is.
Do you have options?
You have. Some games give you more options than others. We're still at a place, for the most part, where it's relatively binary, so you can choose 2 things or 3 things. Some games are better than others when it comes to that. I find that the less graphical fidelity is required, the more open you can be. So right now, for example, I'm playing a game called Wasteland 2, which is nowhere near as graphically impressive as something like AC, but it gives you a ton of freedom. You can approach problems in a million different ways, and depending on what you do, you can unlock or block off entire chunks of content. There are these games, Baldur's Gate, where you can choose to play as a really good person or a really terrible person, and depending on how you play, the game responds to you. A lot of the BioWare games continue to do that. It's not an endless amount of options, and they caught a lot of crap because they sold that as their primary fantasy, and then the conclusion to Mass Effect 3, a lot of people felt like they were robbed of it, which can be tough, again, because they had, up until then, delivered so much that allowed you to really feel like your choices were making a difference in the world. So some games do it, and other games are more interested in telling a very specific story.
Can I ask you quickly, one last question?
Sure.
What is the outer reaches of your market, and do you have aspirations to go further?
I mean, the more people we can get playing games, the better, right? I want everyone playing them. It's good for games, it's good for me, it's good for everyone.
Realistically, who's playing games now?
Everyone is playing games, I'd like to think, and I think that as time goes on, more and more people will be playing games. Everyone's playing different kinds of games, though, right? And that's great. I don't have a problem with that. I don't know that we want a world in which everyone likes and plays the same thing anyway. I like the fact that there's a mix. It was like I was saying earlier. I like that we have games like Call of Duty, and we also have games like Gone Home. They're at completely opposite ends of the spectrum, and they're wonderful, and they're going to appeal and speak to different people, and they provide vastly different experiences, and I'm all about variety. So I think that there's no end. I do think that as technology continues to move towards stuff that is more intuitive and more immersive, whether it's Oculus or something that is, TBD, as we take away that barrier to entry of the controller, I think that games will become even more accessible to people. And so that's something that I am theoretically excited about, but I also feel like as I get older, I'm the kind of person that's really angry that I can't just easily plug a keyboard and mouse into my console. I prefer playing on the PC. So I may be the wrong person. I may be too old now. I may have missed my chance. And it's interesting because what we're also realizing or seeing, or people are speculating, is that so many kids today are growing up with Minecraft as their primary introduction, their great big experience, and that's going to have an impact because it's so freeing and so liberating and so systemic and so player driven that I'm curious to see if that generation grows up less interested in the more linear traditional experiences. I hope not. I really think there's room for both. Sometimes you want to be told a story and sometimes you want to write a story. And I think that we should be providing both of those for people.
So Minecraft, you say
Hello? Hi, my name is Tiffany Fox. I'm a writer. I'm looking for a social media job, but I went to a DigiBC is a digital media association here, and they were talking about tax credit, and they had some game developer representatives there. And then I remembered that I grew up playing role-playing games, and writing for a video game would be awesome. You kind of answered my question with the lady down there earlier about the kind of things in your portfolio. Would it be better to have something diverse or just anything that you feel you're really, really good at?
Yeah, I just think whatever you think best represents your skills. I promise you that it's not a trick question or answer where I'm not looking for, I want to be blown away. That's all we care about. So I don't care what form it takes. If it moves me, that's all that matters.
Hi, my name is Marek. I'm from Vancouver Film School. First of all, congratulations on Assassin's Creed franchise. It served as a true inspiration for some of my stories. A question I have for you is, did the idea of the Assassin's Creed, let's say, develop when you were a teenager and then it slowly just developed, or it was just an idea like, okay, I'm just gonna do this?
The creative director, Patrice, wanted to tell a story about an assassin, and that's where it started. He had a vision. He was the creative director, and he wanted to do something that involved an assassin. He envisioned it being set initially in the Third Crusade, and that was the genesis of it.
Hi. So you talked about how games might be moving away from plots and more towards characters. So with that in mind, would you say that you and the other writers who work on Assassin's Creed focus or spend more time on the narrative aspect of the game or the actual dialogue of the game?
I think it's shifting, right? I think now we want to find ways to focus more on character creation and development. So it's going to be a mix of ensuring that that character is represented by the systems and then also focusing on the dialogue, because that's going to be the most overt representation of their personality. And we found that that's something that's really important to people. So I think that moving forward, there's going to be more focus on character development, more iteration in that regard, and more discussions about making them, looking for ways to express personality traits in a wider variety of ways. I think character-driven versus plot-driven is becoming increasingly interesting. There was a woman from Microsoft at GDC this year. She literally ran tests, and the tests all came back with the same thing. People remember characters, and they don't remember plot. It doesn't mean don't have a plot, doesn't mean don't have an amazing plot. I think most people that played BioShock remember the twist, like Would You Kindly is something that sticks out, right? But again, the protagonist in that game, you don't really remember, right? You remember all the other characters that were around you. And so it's always going to be a little bit different, and there's always going to be room for something that blows people away. But I think it's don't get too bogged down in minute-to-minute stuff, and instead focus on making people fall in love with your characters. Even if they're not the character you're playing, let them fall in love with the characters that inhabit the world, then they're going to want to spend time there. They're going to want to spend time with these cool people. Far Cry is clearly experimenting that, right? That's like their new push is like populate the world with these crazy characters, these over-the-top, larger-than-life personalities, and you'll just want to spend more time in that world.
Hi.
Hi.
You speak very, very well. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
My question is specific with, you mentioned transitioning from publishing to video game writing. I've had a little success with publishing. I work for Random House now, Kids, Pop Manga, and Robot Smash, what comes out in April. Buy the book. So currently working in the publishing field, and then my heart's in video gaming, obviously. I'm very lucky to do what I do in publishing, but making that transition over to video games, you mentioned people that are doing it, like you have friends that did it. How did they make that transition? Was it like writing a story Bible, getting you drunk? Like, how did that work?
I think a lot of people do it by having friends that work places, and then a need comes up for a project, and someone says, hey, how about my friend? It really does work that way. And then there are just, go on publisher and developer websites. Every now and then something will pop up that's saying we're looking for a writer. Every now and then Ubisoft has something that says we're looking for writers, we're looking for narrative directors. So there are occasional job postings, but it's a lot of times it's better if you can come with that recommendation, right? Because it helps move you from the giant stack onto a smaller stack. And that's where, it goes back to that idea of like, being out there and meeting people at these events and trying to like become friendly with developers. It's just another way to push yourself more into the spotlight.
And this is our last question.
Hi, fantastic presentation.
Thanks.
Huge fan of Assassin's Creed series. Loved them all, loved all the stories, even the ones other people hated. It's an odd question to make it the last. Is there any way I could get a copy of your presentation today?
I don't know. I have to ask work. They're the ones that determine whether or not I can. So maybe. I don't know. I have to ask the PR and security people. They think that we work at NASA. I don't think there's anything in there that is proprietary, and it's all been up there. So I just have to ask. They can be very sensitive about things that we wouldn't normally be sensitive about, and they still manage to leak stuff all the time on airplanes. But I don't know.
Corey, that wraps us up our session.
Okay,
so
cool.
thank you so much.
No
on behalf
problem.
of VIF
Thank you for
Industry,
having me.
thank
Thank you all for
so
coming.
much.